While her husband was briefly away from the house, she harmed their 3 children, then attempted to end her own life. 54 minutes later, Patrick Clancy returned home. By then, it was already too late. The person responsible was their mother, and Lindsay Clancy has never denied that. What is much harder to understand is that just hours earlier, Lindsay had taken her daughter to the doctor, watched her children play in the snow, taken pictures of them, and talked about dinner. She was a nurse who specialized in caring for mothers and newborns. Friends described her as a mother who deeply loved her children, and she was back home with her children because just 19 days earlier, one of the country's leading psychiatric hospitals had determined that she was ready to be discharged. Even now, there are still 2 questions the jury has not answered. Was this something she had planned, or had she completely lost her ability to understand reality? And if this was a severe psychiatric breakdown, why did it happen during the one brief period when Patrick was gone, and Lindsay was alone with all 3 children? Before any of this happened, Lindsay Clancy lived in Duxbury, Massachusetts, with her husband Patrick and their 3 young children. Lindsay was born Lindsay Marie Musgrove. She grew up in Connecticut with her parents and younger sister in a quiet residential neighborhood. As a child, she enjoyed riding her bike, gymnastics, and cheerleading. Neighbors remembered her as cheerful and outgoing, an ordinary girl growing up in a quiet Connecticut neighborhood. She later attended Quinnipiac University, where she majored in biology. After graduating, she continued her training in nursing and eventually became a registered nurse. It was around this time that she met Patrick Clancy. That was in 2013. The 2 were introduced through Lindsay's college roommate. They first met around May of that year. 2 months later, they officially began dating. Their relationship continued to grow. In 2015, they moved in together. In December 2016, Lindsay and Patrick got married. By then, Lindsay had also begun her career in nursing. She later became a registered nurse at Massachusetts General Hospital, where she worked for years. And the field she worked in was especially significant: labor and delivery. Her job was to care for mothers and newborn babies. 1 year after their marriage, on December 24, 2017, their daughter Cora was born. On September 30th, 2019, their second child Dawson was born. Then, on May 26, 2022, they welcomed their 3rd child, Callan, 1 daughter, 2 sons. Lindsay had a stable nursing career. Patrick had his own career as well. They had their own home, friends, and support from both sides of the family. From the outside, they looked like any other young family. No one could have imagined that on January 24th, 2023, everything would change in less than an hour. January 24th, 2023. That morning, Lindsay took 5-year-old Cora to see her pediatrician. It was Cora's routine 5-year checkup. But recently, Cora had also been complaining that her stomach was bothering her. After examining her, the doctor believed the problem might be something very common in children: constipation. The doctor suggested that Lindsay could give Cora Miralax. Patrick stayed home with Dawson and Callan. After the appointment, Lindsay brought Cora home. Later, Cora and Dawson went outside to play in the snow. The 2 children even built a snowman together. Lindsay took pictures of them and sent them to Patrick. Patrick later said that Lindsay seemed to be having one of her better days. That afternoon, the entire family was home. Patrick had already been working from home for years, and his home office was in the basement. That afternoon, he was working downstairs while Lindsay spent most of her time upstairs with the 3 children. At approximately 4:02 p.m., Lindsay used her phone to search for children's Miralax. She then searched for a 3V takeout and checked how long it would take to get to the restaurant. After that, Lindsay called a CVS in Kingston and asked whether they had a children's constipation product in stock. An employee told her that they did not have the exact product she was asking about, but they did have a similar product for children. At around 4:53 p.m., even though Patrick was also at home, Lindsay sent him a message because he was working downstairs. She asked whether they should get takeout from 3V for dinner. Patrick agreed. The 2 began choosing what they wanted to order. At approximately 5:10 p.m., Lindsay called 3V and placed the order. A few minutes later, Patrick prepared to leave. He had two things to do. First, he would stop at CVS to buy the product recommended for Cora. Then, he would go to 3V and pick up dinner. Before leaving, Patrick held Callan and kissed Cora. Lindsay then took Callan from Patrick and stood nearby. Patrick told the children, "I'll be right back." Then, he left the house. At approximately 5:32 p.m., Patrick arrived at CVS. When he could not find the product Lindsay wanted, he called his wife. Lindsay did not answer immediately. About a minute later, she called him back. They briefly discussed which children's product he should buy. Patrick later said that Lindsay sounded quieter than usual, as though she might have been busy with something, but he did not think there was anything strange about it. He assumed she was taking care of the children. After buying the product, Patrick continued to 3V. At around 5:54 p.m., restaurant surveillance footage captured Patrick arriving to pick up the food. From the moment Patrick left home until that point, everything still looked like an ordinary family getting dinner on an ordinary Tuesday night. But about 15 minutes later, Patrick walked back through the door. This time, everything had changed. At approximately 6:09 p.m., Patrick returned home. About 54 minutes had passed since he left. The house was unusually quiet. Patrick could not see Lindsay, and he could not hear any of the three children. He called out his wife's name. There was no response. He began looking for her. Upstairs, the primary bedroom door was locked. When he finally got inside, Lindsay was not there. One of the bedroom windows was open, and there was a large amount of blood in the room. Patrick immediately realized something was wrong. He ran outside. Lindsay was there. She had fallen from a second-story window and was seriously injured, but she was still alive. Patrick immediately called 911. Then he asked Lindsay, "Where are the kids?" She answered, "In the basement." Patrick rushed back inside and ran downstairs. There, he first found Cora and Callan in the basement living area. Then, inside his basement home office, he found Dawson. None of the three children appeared responsive. Exercise bands were found on their bodies. The 911 call was still connected. When Patrick found the children, the dispatcher could hear him crying out. At one point, he shouted, "She killed the kids!" Police and emergency personnel arrived soon afterward. Cora and Dawson died that night. 8-month-old Callan still showed signs of life. He was rushed to Boston Children's Hospital. 3 days later, on January 27th, Callan also died. Lindsay survived, but the fall caused a severe spinal injury that ultimately left her paralyzed from the waist down. Police quickly determined that there had been no outside intruder. Lindsay was responsible. The real question was, why? How could a mother, who only hours earlier had taken her daughter to the doctor, watched her children play in the snow, and taken pictures of them harm all three children less than an hour after her husband left? As investigators looked deeper, they discovered something important. That night was not the first time there had been signs that something was seriously wrong. In fact, months earlier, Lindsay had already begun telling people around her that something did not feel right. Several months after her third child, Callan, was born, and as her maternity leave was coming to an end, Lindsay's mental health began to noticeably deteriorate. She became increasingly anxious about returning to work. All three children were still very young. She worried that she would not be able to manage being a nurse while also caring for three children, and this was not the first time she had experienced this. After Cora and Dawson were born, Lindsay had also experienced anxiety when preparing to return to work, but both times, her condition gradually improved. This time, it did not. Her anxiety became increasingly severe. She also began having problems sleeping. Some nights, she slept only a few hours. She felt as though her mind would not stop racing. She became increasingly exhausted, and her mood began to decline. On September 15, 2022, Lindsay began receiving professional mental health treatment. From that point on, the next several months of her life became increasingly consumed by evaluations, treatment, and medication changes. In the months before the incident, she was prescribed several different psychiatric medications. She was not taking all of them at the same time, and the fact that they were prescribed does not mean she remained on all of them for extended periods. Doctors were mainly trying to treat her anxiety, depression, and severe insomnia, but her condition never truly stabilized. By November, her insomnia had become severe enough that Lindsay went to the emergency room seeking help. Patrick and both sides of the family also began helping her look for additional mental health resources. Then, in December, something even more concerning appeared. Lindsay began reporting intrusive thoughts. These were not thoughts she wanted to have. They were unwanted thoughts that entered her mind against her will. Some involved harming herself, others involved harming her children. Lindsay told Patrick about these thoughts. Patrick later recalled asking whether she should temporarily stay away from the children, but Lindsay did not believe that was necessary. And this was part of what made her condition so difficult to understand. Even as her mental health appeared to be deteriorating, Lindsay could still do many ordinary things. Take care of the children, prepare food, handle things around the house, talk to other people, go to medical appointments. At times, she did not appear to be seriously mentally unwell at all, so from the outside, it was difficult to know whether Lindsay was experiencing severe anxiety and depression, or whether something more serious was beginning to develop. By late December, Lindsay and her family believed outpatient treatment was no longer enough. She needed to be hospitalized. In late December 2022, Lindsay went to Massachusetts General Hospital because of her mental health. She was later transferred to McLean Hospital. In the early hours of January 1st, 2023, Lindsay was formally admitted to McLean for voluntary inpatient psychiatric treatment. This became one of the most important points in the entire case, because Lindsay had not simply gone without help. She had already seen medical professionals. She had received different treatments. Her family had been helping her find additional resources, and now she had even been admitted to a psychiatric hospital. Patrick later testified that Lindsay told him she did not feel she was receiving much actual treatment at McLean. According to Patrick's recollection, he visited her 2 or 3 times, and based on what he saw, Patrick felt Lindsay did not appear to be receiving much active treatment. He remembered patients watching television, coloring, or doing clay activities. Patrick described it this way: it looked like mainly nurses. Patrick also said Lindsay had to wait some time before seeing a doctor, partly because she had been admitted during the New Year's holiday. Still, Lindsay continued to receive medical evaluations during her stay, and during those 5 days, the psychiatric team had access to the problems already documented in her medical history: insomnia, depression, suicidal thoughts, and intrusive thoughts about harming her children. But the hospital records did not clearly document the word that would later become central to the entire case: psychosis. There was no clear documentation of hallucinations. There was no clear documentation of delusions. Her safety risk was assessed as low or minimal. On January 5th, 2023, after 5 days in the hospital, Lindsay was discharged. She returned home to Patrick and their 3 children. 19 days later, all 3 children were dead. And that created one of the most difficult questions in the entire case. If Lindsay had truly deteriorated to the point that, by January 24th, she could no longer understand the wrongfulness of her actions, why had 5 days of inpatient observation, just 19 days earlier, not clearly identified psychosis? Did her condition change after she left McLean, or were symptoms already developing but not recognized at the time? That question would later become a major part of the trial. But investigators were also looking at something much more immediate: what Lindsay actually did on January 24th. And those actions seemed to point in a very different direction. Investigators went back through everything Lindsay did that afternoon: searching for children's medicine, searching for 3V, checking the route, contacting CVS, planning dinner, and then having Patrick leave the house to go to the pharmacy and the restaurant. After Patrick left, the 3 children died. To prosecutors, the sequence mattered. Their theory was that these arrangements created a window of time, a period when Lindsay would be alone in the house with the 3 children. And they pointed to more than just the errands. Earlier that morning, Cora's pediatrician had not noticed anything obviously unusual about Lindsay. She could understand questions, she could answer normally, and she could manage her daughter's medical care. Even after Patrick left the house, Lindsay was still able to use her phone. When Patrick could not find the product at CVS, he called his wife. Lindsay called him back and told him which product to buy. To prosecutors, all of this suggested that Lindsay could still think, communicate, plan, and carry out purposeful actions. So the prosecution's theory was this: Lindsay knew what she was doing and should be held criminally responsible for the deaths of her 3 children. That argument did not require prosecutors to deny that Lindsay had been struggling with her mental health. She clearly had. She had sought treatment, she had reported intrusive thoughts, and she had been hospitalized. But legally, those facts alone did not answer the central question. Because having a mental illness does not automatically mean lacking criminal responsibility. The question was whether, at the time of the incident, Lindsay was so mentally ill that she could not understand the wrongfulness of her actions. And after the incident, a new piece of information emerged that would become central to the defense's answer. Lindsay said she had heard a voice. 11 days after the deaths, February 4th, 2023, forensic psychologist Dr. Paul Zeizel received court approval to enter Lindsay's hospital room for the first time. At the time, Lindsay was handcuffed to the hospital bed and guarded by police officers. She asked if she could speak to Patrick. Doctor allowed her to use his phone. The first time Patrick did not answer. 2 days later, on February 6th, they tried again. This time, Patrick answered. The call was on speakerphone. Lindsay first told Patrick that she loved him very much. Then she said she had heard a male voice. The voice told her that she had no choice, that she had to harm the 3 children and then end her own life. This was very different from the intrusive thoughts she had previously reported. Intrusive thoughts are unwanted thoughts that enter a person's mind. What Lindsay was now describing was something else, a voice that she believed she could hear. The defense argued that this was an auditory hallucination. As the evaluation continued, Doctor also observed other symptoms. These included depersonalization and derealization. In other words, a feeling of being disconnected from yourself or from the world around you. Lindsay had also experienced paranoia. She worried that other people could somehow know or even hear her thoughts, and she feared that her children might be taken away from her because of them. Ultimately, Doctor concluded that Lindsay had bipolar disorder with postpartum psychosis. His professional opinion was that on January 24, 2023, Lindsay was unable to understand the wrongfulness of her actions. But that diagnosis had to explain something the prosecution had already emphasized: Lindsay's behavior that afternoon. If she was psychotic, how could she still use her phone, take care of the children, arrange dinner, and communicate normally with other people? Doctor's explanation was that psychosis is not an on and off switch. He compared hallucinations to waves at the beach. They come and go. A person could appear completely normal at certain moments while still experiencing psychotic symptoms. Zeizel also evaluated Lindsay for signs that she might be exaggerating or pretending to have psychiatric symptoms. According to his assessment, there was no indication that she was malingering, but there was still one major problem for the defense: the male voice. Remember what had happened just weeks earlier. Lindsay had seen psychiatrists, nurses, emergency room medical staff, and had spent 5 days at McLean Hospital. Those records documented depression, insomnia, suicidal thoughts, and intrusive thoughts, but there was no clear record that Lindsay had told any of those doctors about a male voice telling her to harm her children. That distinction mattered because the male voice was now being used as evidence that Lindsay had been experiencing psychosis. So the question became, had Lindsay already been hearing this voice but simply never told her doctors? Or had the voice only been reported after the incident? And if so, what could it actually prove about her mental state on January 24th? July 2026. More than 3 years after the deaths of the 3 children, Lindsay Clancy's trial finally began. She faced 3 counts of first-degree murder. From the beginning, this trial was not about finding another person responsible. The defense did not dispute that Lindsay caused the deaths of the 3 children. The question for the jury was criminal responsibility. In other words, on January 24th, 2023, was Lindsay suffering from such a severe mental illness that she could no longer understand the wrongfulness of her actions? One of the most important witnesses was Patrick Clancy. By then, he was Lindsay's ex-husband. Over 2 days, Patrick described their life together, Lindsay's worsening mental health during the months before the incident, and the 54 minutes he was away from the house on January 24th. Then the jury heard the 911 call. The entire recording lasted approximately 7 minutes. Under a court order, the recording was not played publicly, but reporters inside the courtroom were allowed to hear it. After Patrick returned home, he first found Lindsay seriously injured outside the house. On the recording, he could be heard repeatedly trying to keep her conscious. He said, "Look at me, look at me. Lynn, look at me, open your eyes." Emergency responders then began treating Lindsay. Patrick remained on the phone and ran back inside to search for the 3 children. When he reached the basement, people in the courtroom heard him cry out. Then Patrick shouted, "She killed the kids!" As the recording played in court, Lindsay buried her face in her hands and began to cry. Several jurors also appeared visibly affected. As the trial continued, the jury began hearing about the Lindsay people knew before January 24th. The Clancy family's former nanny, Elaine Rossi, took the stand. She had helped care for the 3 children in 2022. She knew Lindsay was experiencing postpartum mental health problems. She had also noticed Lindsay's insomnia and weight loss. But Rossi said she had never believed Lindsay was a danger to the children. She described the woman she knew as a mother who deeply loved her children. Lindsay's mother, Paula Musgrove, and her sister, Allison Ozga, also took the stand. They described a very different side of Lindsay's life. In the months before the incident, severe anxiety, paranoia, suicidal ideation, fear of being alone, and thoughts about harming the children. Lindsay's former mother-in-law, Susan Clancy, also testified. She described Lindsay before the incident as someone who was begging for help. Then, the jury saw Lindsay's own words. November 18th, 2022. More than 2 months before the deaths of her children. In her journal, Lindsay wrote about desperately wanting a mental break from the pressure of taking care of everyone. She even wrote that her mind seemed to be trying to find something physically wrong with her. Journal entries from the same period also documented severe brain fog, insomnia, anxiety, and her growing difficulty functioning normally. The entries themselves did not say that Lindsay wanted to harm her children. But the prosecution and defense saw 2 very different things in those words. To the defense, the journals showed a mental state that had been steadily deteriorating for months. To the prosecution, they showed that Lindsay was struggling, but not necessarily that she had lost touch with reality. And most importantly, the journals could not establish whether she understood the wrongfulness of her actions on January 24th. The defense then called Dr. Paul Zeizel. His testimony brought the trial back to the question at the center of the defense, postpartum psychosis, and with it, the male voice. But prosecutors challenged how much Zeizel's diagnosis could actually prove. Because Zeizel had not evaluated Lindsay before January 24th, he first met her after the children had died. That made the earlier medical records especially important. The doctors and medical staff who had actually treated Lindsay before the incident had documented serious mental health problems. But they had not clearly diagnosed psychosis, and they had not clearly documented the male voice that later became so important to the defense. Then another witness complicated that issue. A chaplain at Brigham and Women's Hospital, Sheila Cavanaugh. Cavanaugh told the jury that Lindsay had described a persistent male voice. She also recalled Lindsay saying that she was glad the children were now safe. That mattered because Lindsay had now described a similar voice to someone other than Zeizel, but prosecutors immediately pointed out another problem. In the written notes Cavanaugh made at the time, she did not document that Lindsay had told her about hearing a voice. During cross-examination, Cavanaugh acknowledged that. But she explained that her role was to provide spiritual care, not psychiatric evaluation. Her notes were not intended to be word-for-word records of every conversation, so her testimony did not settle the question. Instead, it left the jury with another conflict to consider. There was now another witness who remembered Lindsay describing a male voice, but there was still no written record of that conversation. As of the end of proceedings on August 20th, 2026, the case still had not yet gone to the jury for deliberations. Additional doctors were still expected to testify. After that would come closing arguments, and only then would the case formally be handed to the jury. So at that point, there was still no verdict. Lindsay herself had not testified. That meant the jury would not hear her take the witness stand and personally explain what she believed happened. Instead, they would have to make their decision based on Patrick's testimony, the 911 recording, Lindsay's journals, her medical records, testimony from family members, and expert opinions. And from all of that, they would have to decide what was Lindsay Clancy actually experiencing on January 24th, 2023.